Your tomato plant is loaded with fruit, and then one morning, the bottom of one turns dark, sunken and leathery. Almost overnight, it's probably not your soil, and it's not a bug. Something in how you're caring for this plant is quietly working against it, and it's easy to miss. Most gardeners across the US reach for a calcium spray. The moment they see this, every label says calcium deficiency. So calcium feels like the fix. It's not your soil. Most home gardens already have plenty of calcium sitting in the dirt. It's not pests either. No chew marks, just a smooth sunken patch. It's not really the variety. Switching tomato types won't fix a watering habit. Dry, leathery, right at the bottom of the fruit, that's blossom end rot. So what is it? Then here's what's actually happening. This isn't a supply problem. It's a delivery problem. Calcium doesn't move through a tomato plant on its own. It has no way to travel to wherever it's needed. It moves exclusively dissolved in water, riding along inside the plant's water-conducting tissue called the xylem, the same tissue that pulls moisture up from the roots and pushes it out through the leaves. That upward flow is called the transpiration stream, and it's driven mostly by water evaporating out of the leaves. Here's the part almost nobody explains. Leaves transpire a lot, and fruit barely transpires at all because tomato skins have very few of the tiny pores called stomata that leaves are covered in. So water and the calcium riding inside it gets pulled hard toward the leaves, and only a trickle makes it out to the fruit. When watering swings between soaked and bone dry, that trickle becomes even less reliable, and the blossom end, the point farthest from the stem, is the first place to run short. So the plant isn't malfunctioning. It's choosing. Keeping its leaves alive matters more to it than protecting one piece of fruit it's already committed to. Since more flowers, more fruit can usually follow. If the plant itself survives, it's not failing to feed the tomato. It's protecting the part of itself it can't easily replace over the part it can. Strange thing to realize about a plant that looks completely still right now. Think about the last time you saw a flower on this plant. Every flower that opens is the plant spending energy on the possibility of more fruit later. A leaf that plant already built is a sure thing. It's already working, already producing the sugar the whole plant runs on. So when water gets tight, favoring the leaf over the fruit isn't the plant losing the plot. It's the plant protecting the one asset. It can't quickly rebuild. There's another piece of this that makes it trickier to fix after the fact. Once calcium settles into a leaf's cell walls, it tends to stay there. According to research from University of Wisconsin Extension, it isn't shuttled back out and redistributed to the fruit later on. So you can't really make up for a rough patch of inconsistent watering during fruit set by simply watering better a week later. Once you notice the spot forming, the window that matters most is the 2 to 3 weeks when a fruit is actively sizing up, roughly from when it's small and green through about half its full size, since that's when it's pulling in whatever calcium happens to be moving through the plant at that moment. Miss that window, and very little of any calcium you add afterward reaches back into that fruit. It's also worth knowing that soil pH and soil calcium levels play a supporting role here, just a smaller one than most gardeners assume. According to University of Maryland Extension, low soil pH and genuinely low calcium levels, along with shallow or inconsistent watering and heavy nitrogen use, all factor into how often this shows up. So if your soil tests unusually acidic, that's worth addressing too. But for most home gardens in the US with reasonably normal soil, watering consistency is still the lever that moves the needle most. And this also explains why it's specifically the blossom end that fails, not the shoulder near the stem. The stem end is the first stop off the water highway coming up from the roots, first access to whatever calcium is moving through. The blossom end, directly opposite, is the last stop, the farthest point the water has to travel once it branches into the fruit. Steady supply, no problem. Inconsistent supply, and the last stop on the line comes up short first. That's a big part of why the damage shows up at that one spot instead of spreading evenly. Right now, press a finger 2 inches into the soil near your plant. If it's dry at that depth, even though the surface looks damp, that's your first sign you're underwatering at the root zone while thinking you're watering enough, and it's worth remembering for what's coming next. Now let's talk about how a careful gardener ends up here, because nobody does this on purpose. You water a little bit most days because it feels responsible, because you don't want to overdo it and cause root rot, which is a real risk too. So you end up giving frequent, shallow drinks instead of infrequent, deep ones. That habit looks exactly like diligence. It feels like care. The problem is shallow watering never reaches the deeper roots, so those roots stay chronically underwatered even while the top of the soil looks fine. And every time you go a day or two without watering during a hot stretch, or a hard rain suddenly soaks everything after a dry week, you get the swing between drought and flood that starves the fruit of calcium. There's a second version of this same habit, and it involves the hose itself. A quick pass with the sprayer over the top of the plant feels thorough. Water hits the leaves, water hits the soil, everything looks wet, but a fast overhead pass rarely gives the soil enough time to actually absorb before it runs off, especially once the mulch layer is thin. So you end up with a plant that looks freshly watered on the surface while the root zone underneath barely got touched. And if you're leaning on rainfall to fill the gaps between waterings, that's its own source of inconsistency. Since a dry week followed by a sudden downpour is close to the textbook pattern that triggers this. Right now, check your leaves in the mid-afternoon on a hot day. If they're slightly curled or a little droopy, even though the soil surface looks moist, that's a second sign. The plant's water demand is outpacing what its roots are pulling in, and the transpiration stream is already under enough stress that calcium delivery to the fruit is likely falling behind. There's a third habit worth naming here too, and it's an easy one to miss because it looks like you're doing everything right. If you're watering consistently, but you've got bare soil around the base of the plant, you can still get the same wet-dry swing on a hot, windy day. Since bare soil loses moisture to the air far faster than soil under a mulch layer, right now, look at the ground around your plant stem. If you can see bare dirt rather than a couple inches of straw, leaves, or wood mulch, that gap is working against your watering schedule, even if the schedule itself is solid. Here's the habit to stop immediately. Stop watering on a fixed daily schedule, regardless of what the soil actually needs. That single habit, watering because it's Tuesday rather than because the soil at root depth is actually dry, is very likely the biggest driver of the inconsistency, causing this switch your trigger from, it's been a day to, I check 2 to 3 inches down and it's dry. And you've already removed the most common cause. Now, for the part where this gets pulled into something you can actually run day to day, tomatoes need roughly 1 to 1.5 inches of water per week, delivered as 1 or 2 deep soakings rather than 7 shallow ones. A deep soaking means watering slowly enough and long enough that moisture reaches 6 to 8 inches down, which you can check by pushing a finger or a small trowel into the soil about an hour after watering. If you're using a hose, that's usually 20 to 30 minutes of slow, low pressure watering at the base of the plant. Not a quick overhead spray. Drip irrigation on a simple timer is one of the most effective upgrades you can make here, since it delivers water slowly and consistently without you having to remember. Here's the part most watering advice skips entirely, and it's a genuinely old trick, not a new gadget. Bury an unglazed clay pot called an olla in the soil next to your plant with just the neck poking above the surface, then fill it with water and cap it. According to University of Arizona Cooperative Extension, the clay walls are porous enough that soil moisture tension pulls water out through them only when the surrounding soil actually dries, and holds it in when the soil is already wet, which is a completely different mechanism from a timer that just runs on a schedule whether the plant needs it or not. Pueblo County Extension in Colorado specifically calls this out as effective for tomatoes because it removes the wet-dry swing at the root, not just at the surface. You bury it once at planting, fill it every 2 to 5 days depending on your weather, and the soil around it self-regulates without you having to guess whether yesterday's watering actually soaked in deep enough. It's not a replacement for the basics above. It's the upgrade that closes the exact gap. A timer or a watering can can't, since neither of those actually senses what the soil is doing. Mulch matters just as much as the watering schedule. A 2 to 3 inch layer of straw, shredded leaves, or wood mulch around the base of the plant, kept a couple inches back from the stem, slows evaporation from the soil surface dramatically, which smooths out the wet-dry swings even on hot days. Beds with bare soil can swing hard between soaked and bone-dry within a single afternoon. Mulch beds hold that moisture far longer. If your tomatoes are in containers, this matters even more. Since pots dry out faster and swing between wet and dry more dramatically than garden soil, container-grown tomatoes may need checking daily in hot weather, sometimes watering once or even twice a day at peak summer heat, testing it 2 inches deep each time rather than watering on autopilot. A self-watering container or a simple drip line on a timer removes most of the guesswork. One more number worth having: hold off on high nitrogen fertilizers once your plant starts flowering and setting fruit. Excess nitrogen pushes the plant toward more leafy growth, which increases transpiration demand even further and pulls even more water and calcium toward the leaves instead of the fruit. Switch to a balanced or lower nitrogen feed. Something closer to a 5-10-10 ratio. Once fruit starts forming, timing matters too. Water before 9 in the morning, whenever your schedule allows, since that gives moisture time to soak down to the root zone before the heat of the day pulls it back out through the leaves. And if you've already reached for a calcium spray or scattered eggshells around the base of the plant, here's the honest read on why those so often don't move. The needle sprays land almost entirely on the leaf surface. And remember, fruit skin has very few of the stomata that would let a foliar spray actually absorb into it. Eggshells break down far too slowly to supply calcium on the timeline a growing fruit needs. Neither addresses the water delivery problem, so neither is where your effort should go first. If a soil test shows genuinely low calcium or a pH below roughly 6.2, adding lime or a slow-release calcium source over the season is reasonable. But it's a secondary step. A basic home soil test kit, the kind sold at most garden centers in the US, will give you a pH reading in a few minutes. And it's worth doing once at the start of the season if you've never checked. Tomatoes generally do best somewhere in the 6.2 to 6.8 range. If your reading comes back well outside that window, that's a separate fix worth handling alongside the watering changes, not instead of them, since even perfect pH won't help much if the watering pattern underneath it is still swinging between soaked and bone dry. Most test kits also give you a rough calcium reading on the same strip or dial, so you'll usually walk away from the same 5-minute test knowing both numbers at once, rather than needing a separate trip or a lab sample if a tomato already has the rot on it. That particular fruit won't reverse, but that doesn't mean the plant is done. Pull off any obviously affected fruit so the plant isn't spending energy on it, and put your effort into watering consistency instead. This is very commonly a self-limiting problem. The first flush of fruit is often the one that shows it. Since those early fruits grow fast, while your watering habits are still getting dialed in, and once your watering evens out, most growers see later, fruit set coming clean. Right now, check your green tomatoes, specifically the ones roughly half their full size, for a small, water-soaked, pale green to tan patch right at the very bottom. That patch is the opening act, appearing before the fruit fully darkens and leathers over. And catching it early is your signal to tighten up watering immediately, rather than waiting for the whole harvest to show the same pattern. So what should you actually expect once you make these changes? Most growers see fewer new cases within roughly 2 to 3 weeks of switching to deep, consistent watering and adding mulch. Since that's typically enough time for a new flush of flowers to set fruit under steadier conditions, it won't be instant. And any fruit that already has the rot won't reverse, but the pattern going forward tends to improve noticeably once the wet-dry swing is smoothed out. You'll likely notice the improvement in stages. First, check the soil itself over the next week or two. If you're sticking to the deep, less frequent routine, the top few inches should stay evenly damp rather than swinging to fully dry between sessions. Next, watch your existing green fruit. The ones that were still small when you changed your routine are the ones most likely to size up clean. And if your leaves had that mid-afternoon curl from earlier, that's usually one of the first things to resolve, often within a handful of days. If you've added mulch on the same day you fix the watering schedule, expect the biggest visible shift around the 3 to 4 week mark. Since that roughly matches how long it takes a flower that opens today to become a green tomato at the half-size stage where the calcium window actually matters. Fruit that was already past that stage when you made the change is largely locked into whatever pattern it already picked up. But everything that flowers from here forward is working with the more even supply you just built. Here's one related adjustment worth knowing, since it plugs into the same mechanism. If you're growing large beefsteak or paste-type tomatoes, you'll likely see this far more than if you're growing cherry or grape tomatoes. And that's not random. Cherry tomatoes finish sizing up in a short window, often just a couple weeks from bloom to full size, which doesn't give inconsistent watering much time to interrupt calcium delivery before the fruit is basically done growing. Big beefsteaks take several weeks to fill out, and every one of those weeks is another chance for a dry spell or a sudden downpour to throw things off. If you're set on growing the bigger varieties, that's exactly where a consistent, mulched, deep watering routine earns its keep most. One last note on the mulch itself, since not all of it behaves the same way. Straw and shredded leaves break down slowly and hold moisture evenly, which is what you want here. Fresh wood chips work too, but they can temporarily pull nitrogen out of the topmost soil layer as they break down. So keep them a little clear of the stem. Skip plastic mulch in hot climates if you can, since it can trap heat against the soil and speed up evaporation on the hottest, sunniest days, working against the exact consistency you're trying to build. Grass clippings are a common go-to as well, and they work, but only in a thin layer. A couple inches piled fresh and wet can mat down and actually block water from reaching the soil underneath, which defeats the point entirely. Your tomato plant was never sick, and it wasn't missing calcium in the soil. It was working with an uneven water supply, sending what little it had toward the leaves it needed to survive, and the fruit at the far end of the line paid for that shortage. Even out the watering, keep the soil covered, and check those green fruits early and often, and the next flush off that same plant should look the way you pictured it back when you first planted it.